Hello, thanks for joining me. What I want to talk about here is compassionate conservatism as a concept and as a record, i.e., what is the record? Um, so, I've been reading this book, Back to Basics by Peter Snowden. It charts the rise of the new conservatives in individuals like David Cameron, George Osborne, William Hague, um, from the early 1990s, the 1992 general election, right up to the 2010 general election. I was reading this from Dumfries to Newcastle. I've got up to about there. I'm quite a slow reader. But I've got up to the section on Ian Duncan Smith, who served as Conservative leader from 2001 to 2003. So I want to talk a bit about the concept of compassionate conservatism, and I'm going to be looking at this from different angles. There's a lot I want to cover, so bear with me. Just a disclaimer before I continue, this is very important. I personally know right now people who are conservatives, that is, members of the Conservative Party. I don't know any MPs directly, but I know people who class themselves as conservatives, they're conservative members, they vote Tory. And quite a few of these people I like on a personal basis. I find them to be perfectly decent people. And so when I'm talking about these things, I'm not so much attacking individuals, at least not at the base level. Rather, what I see as the contradictions in the concept. So there's a lot to cover. Let me just get straight into it. This book, Back to Basics, is a very interesting read. And like I say, it's got up to the time when Ian Duncan Smith was leader from 2001 to 2003. And like a lot of Conservative leaders at that time, kind of seemed like a carousel because Tony Blair was just dominating one after another. Um, I think one of the reasons New Labour was so successful is because Blair took a lot of the talking points that the Tories had been about and he took them in for Labour. Now, Corbynites would say this is evidence of Blair's portrayal of socialism and how Tony Blair was, in their view, a closet conservative. It's definitely true Blair switched the party to the right, but I think that he really had no other choice. I think it was the only way the Labour were ever going to get elected was to pitch to the centre, and some of that meant getting into the centre right of politics. Um, but that's history. I don't want to talk about the history of the Labour Party here. Tony Blair won 3 general elections. That's the record. He was a strong prime minister. What I want to talk rather is more recent developments and the idea of compassionate conservatism that came about in the Cameron era. Now, a little bit of history. There is a record, there is historical examples of benevolent conservatives, some very famous examples. William Wilberforce and Lord Shaftesbury being 2 prominent examples. So when conservatives get defensive about being seen as a nasty party, it's understandable why they would point to historic precedents like that. There is many examples of benevolent conservatives in British history, people who really did look at moral causes and they took them on. Um, but I'm thinking more of recent history and how this concept matches reality. So, as a concept, what is compassionate conservatism? And I think it is the idea that society's problems are a collective problem, therefore, our collective come down to collective responsibility. And that's one of the conservatives, and not just the party, conservatives in general, their core principles is responsibility. Now, this is a totally fine concept, it's a totally noble concept. There is something to be said for that because there are some people who expect the government to do everything. In fact, there was a book published a while back, and this is not to get outside the realm of British politics, but I think it's related. John F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, conservative. And the book was arguing that a lot of Kennedy's positions were actually more conservative than liberal. One of his most famous speeches, of course, is ask not what your country could do for you, ask what you could do for your country. So this taps into the conservative notion of responsibility. Now, I don't believe that conservatives have ownership of that, but I do think it's fair to say that is one of their major values. And it's a very good value. It's something that, it's hard to argue against individual responsibility. So I've nothing against that in principle. But if we look at Cameron's Big Society, and Ian Duncan Smith within the context of this, Ian Duncan Smith served as Work and Pension Secretary. Now, what happened in Cameron's Big Society was a very eventful 6 years. It came on the top of the Great Recession. And in the early 2010s, late 2000s, early 2010s, there was understandably a lot of animosity towards the huge greed in the City of London. And it wasn't just, red flag carrying socialists who were angry about this. I remember being furious about the utter imbalance in society, seeing greedy bankers take undeserved massive bonuses whilst people really were struggling on the margins of society. It was a perverse division. So David Cameron came in some ways echoing Tony Blair as a modernizer, as very media savvy leader. And he came up with this concept of a big society. We're all in it together. We'll get through this. There's going to be austerity, but we're all in it together. George Osborne, like a lot of chancellors, was more hard-nosed, more technocratic. But what was the reality of the big society when every major issue that came into the question of basic fairness, the News of the World scandal, for example, banking bonuses, all these issues, the Tory response could at best be seen as muted. And yet, the 2010 general election campaign was largely built on a Tory promise to get tough on the unemployed. And I remember an utterly shameful poster that they put out, we'll make the scroungers work. It's not for word, but it was along those lines. And it was pitching to the most cynical sort of populism, trying to get the majority against the minority. Now, people will say the majority were already angry about those issues. And there is something to be said about populism tapping into how people feel. But populism, we do need to be wary about populism when it is targeting people who cannot defend themselves. And how can an unemployed person go up against the power of the Murdoch empire? So I think that was Cameron and his party basically giving a nod to the likes of the Daily Mail and the Sun. And I think it was pretty despicable. We can dismiss that as one badly judged billboard campaign, but actually that was just the icing on the cake of what was to come, because from 6 years of Tory austerity, and it's not completely subsided, let's say 9 years of Tory austerity, has it really been a case of everyone's treated the same? Do the Tories really go out of their way to lambast corrupt multimillionaires in the way that they hammer and vilify, say, a single mother who's a shoplifter or a claimant who is taking advantage of the system? I don't think they do. Why didn't we hear massive outrage from the government? The government, when the JD Sports scandal was going on, Mike Ashley um, being exposed for the despicable toad that he is, the sickening exploitation that was going on in JD Sports. Now the Conservatives are, oh, we had committees, we grilled Ashley and so on, but the way I see it is the Tories always take a different attitude to those in power. They still treat them with respect that they don't treat those who are on the bottom rungs of society. So yeah, they might ask them some tough questions in committee meetings, but I think the fundamental attitude is different. I mean, you're never going to see a Tory election campaign saying we'll make corrupt CEOs pay for exploitation. You're far more likely to see we'll make lazy dole scroungers work for their benefits, something along those lines. So I think it's a bit perverse to talk about we're all in this together when there's so blatantly a different attitude that they take. And I think what really comes down to conservative thinking is a kind of survival of the fittest mentality. It's this idea that one size fits all, that if I could do it, so can you. Therefore, if you're struggling, it must be your own fault. I know conservatives who are compassionate towards homeless people. They say, if I've seen it. I have conservative friends who, they don't stick their nose up to the homeless. They will buy them a coffee and so on. So I don't believe that every conservative is wicked. But I do think that the party needs to have introspection. In recent years, Labour's been coming under the spotlight because of the far left positions of Jeremy Corbyn and his worldview, and because of the anti Semitism. And there's very good ground for that. But the Tories shouldn't get this arrogant idea that because the focus now is on the extremes of the Labour Party, that people are going to overlook their record. David Cameron did pitch for a more progressive approach in the sense that he realised that in the 21st century the party needs to be more inclusive. Now, I give Cameron credit for that. There were areas, for example, attitudes of gay people and minorities that do hugely contrast with the past, the dark old days of the 70s, when there really was rampant racism. The Conservatives, what's the record? They've had two women prime ministers and they've had Britain's first visibly ethnic minority Home Secretary. So the record, I do think they have improved. However, they still play a very cynical form of populism, particularly when it comes to the unemployed. And I have a big problem with that because people need to know the reality. When Ian Duncan Smith was Work and Pensions Secretary, what was happening? The DWP was subjecting people. I'm talking about past tense, this is still going on. They subject people to degrading work capability assessments to see that if they could really work. And these were people who had genuine health problems, severe problems like fibromyalgia, which can have devastating consequences. People who had um, paperwork from the doctors to prove this. In some cases, cancer patients. And what happened? The DWP sent them threatening letters. Just this shows the callousness of jobs worths at the DWP. And in some cases, sadly, it really did lead people to take their own lives. Ian Duncan Smith arrogantly had the gall to say there was no evidence of a connection between suicides and the harsh measures that were going on in the DWP. His successor, Esther McVeigh, just as bad, just as out of touch, just as callous. Now, Ian Duncan Smith has actually got quite a lot of respect from grassroots Tories for his work on social cohesion and these sort of things. But his record as Work and Pensions Secretary, to me, is what matters. And his record was very much of the philosophy, this kind of patronising attitude that Tories take, that we know best. We're not going to ask unemployed people, but we're treating them like criminals and everything but name. But you know what's for their own good. So when Conservative ministers were pushing on these issues, that was always their go-to. Or we're trying to get people back into work, and they will point to the fact they've got so many people back into work. But what they're not talking about is people who voluntarily drop out of the system because they can no longer stomach being treated that way. That's not a record to be proud of. Driving people to suicide is not a record to be proud of. Now, I don't believe that Ian Duncan Smith wakes up in the morning and says, oh, which unemployed person am I going to hound to death today? But his record as work and pension secretary and the record of his successors, the likes of Esther McVeigh, for people going through that, what they saw was sheer, cold blooded callousness and an absolute refusal to try and have any empathy or understanding as to what people were going through. That film, I, Daniel Blake, I haven't seen it, partly because it was very raw, it was very close to home, and I've been through the welfare system. I know what it's like. It's set in Newcastle, so from everything I've heard, it really hits the nail on the head. So when the Tories talk about this one nation Toryism, compassionate conservatism, etc., it's all very well, but if you're not going to show the same sort of outrage over Mike Ashley at JD Sports as you are to some claimant you've seen on Jeremy Kyle, then you cannot say that there's a consistent approach because there clearly isn't. And just for the record, I don't condone people cheating the system. There are extreme cases. You'll get, for example, some guy who's had, I don't know, 10 different children by eight women and he's taken in thousands of benefits. That's wrong. Of course, it's wrong and it should be condemned. But the Conservatives have a party, have very much taken this populist idea that they're all one and the same, and they'll deny that. When she was Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, I wrote to Theresa May's office to take issue with the attitude the Tories took on this, and her attitude or her office's attitude was to basically blame it on the media. Oh, we're very sorry if you, Mr. Hazlitt, perceive that this is the Tory attitude. I can assure you that it's not. And she accused the media of distorting it. But then their record ever since has shown that is precisely the case. The Tories believe that if they come across as hard on the unemployed, it will get them votes. And sadly, it probably will. I just wish the wider public, people who've never been through this, and you know what's interesting? The people who are most critical of the unemployed, the people who are most vitriolic in the way they look down on claimants, have never been through it. And they often boast, I've never had to sign on, I've never been unemployed, as if that's a badge of honour. Ignoring the fact that there are people, for example, who are made redundant, who are in situations that really are beyond their control. So the Conservative mantra about responsibility is fine. Nothing wrong with that on in itself. But you have to consider that people have different life experiences. So promoting the family is all very well, but don't talk about single fathers and single mothers as if they're all bad people. Don't treat claimants like they're criminals in everything but name. We have a welfare state in this country which was set up to give people a safety net on hard times. And sure, you can argue that it's being abused, and you can argue that reforms are needed. The problem is the Tory approach to reforms, and frankly, New Labour would have taken this approach as well if they stayed in power, is to punish claimants because it's all for their own good, so called tough love. But patronising people in that way, degrading them, treating them like criminals, and then saying it's all for your own good, you're not going to get thanked for that. You know, forcing people into workfare, forcing them to do work with no money is not incitement to work. That isn't going to encourage people to see the values of hard work. Many claimants want to work, but they don't want to be treated like criminals. They don't want to be forced into a warehouse somewhere and told, oh, well, you have to do this for your benefits. But that's not equitable to a salary. That's hardly a wage. If you actually break it down, it works out at far less than the national minimum wage. So the Conservative go-to would be, oh, what are they complaining about? They're getting benefits. But the fact of the matter is the majority of claimants are not getting the vast amounts of money that, unfortunately, the wider public think they are. And it's thanks to the distortion of the likes of the Daily Mail and the Sun, which is then endorsed by the Conservative Party. And it's the most cynical, and, in my view, shameful form of populism to distort the facts in order to have a go at people who are not in a position to defend themselves. And they put you in this horrible position whereby we're going to treat you like dirt, we're going to talk down to you. You know, jobs worse at the DWP will talk down to you like you're a criminal. We're going to force you to do unpaid work. We're going to force you to do degrading checklists of 35 hours a week job search, even though that's physically impossible in some cases. Um, and you can't complain because we're giving you the benefits. But then if you opt to go out of the system, then you have the financial wilderness where you're not getting, you know, you're in financial dire straits. So it's an awful choice that people have to make. It's the 21st century equivalent of whether to go into the workhouse or not. There is definitely need for welfare reform, but not the way the Tories think. Not the way of let's see how hard we can hammer the unemployed and then insist that it's for their own good. I have very strong views on that because I've been through it. And I think that ultimately there is a sort of survival of the fittest mentality in the sense that a lot of conservatives believe if I could do it, so can everyone. They don't look at individual life circumstances. And I think as a party, I'm not talking about individuals. Like I said at the start of the video, I know decent conservatives who are compassionate people. But as a party, I still think they have a very long way to go to show that they really are a party that has compassion. Because the conservative go to almost every time is if someone is struggling, it must be their own fault. It's because of bad decisions they've made. It's because they're lazy. This is the conservative mentality so often when social problems are raised. And the glaring fact of the matter is, you know, when all the eulogies for Thatcher were made, people conveniently forget that crime and homelessness skyrocketed under her tenure. I give Thatcher credit. I make a fair assessment of every Prime Minister. But people do conveniently overlook that. And the same thing has happened with 9 years of the Conservatives now. What's happening? Rough sleeping is skyrocketing, violent crime is skyrocketing. And yes, there's individual responsibility. If someone chooses to assault someone when they get too drunk, that's entirely their own fault. But there are legitimate questions about police cuts and about a range of other factors connected to austerity. So when Conservatives talk about we're all in this together, I'd like to see a bit more consistency. I'd like to see Conservatives being just as vocal against the likes of Mike Ashley, who, as far as I'm concerned, is an on-jailed criminal, as they are on single mothers and others who really are on the margins of society. And I'm no lefty, I'm no liberal when it comes to issues like crime. And when it comes to, you know, there is a really grimy side of this country. There is a yob culture. You'll find I'm pretty conservative on those issues. But there has to be a consistency. And if they're not going to be outspoken on millionaire criminals as they are on criminals at the lower end of the scale, just one more example to demonstrate the sort of conservative thinking I'm talking about. When Sadiq Khan spoke about cracking down on middle class and upper class people who are using class A drugs, the response was, "Oh, he's a terrible mayor. He should stick to, you know, yobs and thugs and all the rest of it." That's fine, tackling those issues, but middle class and upper class drug users are fueling this trade. Khan was right about that. He's not been right about everything. He was right about that. And when the Conservative knee jerk response was to defend those people, it says a lot about their lack of consistency. And I'll leave it there.